to illness, information item number 1 will be postponed until January. I suspect they're prepared, but we just do not have our presenters with us today. So we are focusing just on information items today. But prior to beginning those, let me begin by announcing that General Statute 138A-15 mandates that the chair inquire as to whether any member knows of any known conflict of interest or appearance of conflict with respect to matters before the commission. That is our information items, for which you've probably seen PowerPoint presentations. If any member knows of a conflict of interest or appearance of conflict, please state so at this time. I do not see anyone raising their hand or any announcements. So for the record, there are none. And our second preliminary matter is approval of the meeting minutes from the air quality meeting held September 13th, 2023 in Morehead City. So I welcome a motion for approval or correction.
There is one. I did notice one correction on the draft minutes. It's on page 4.
Yes.
And about midway down the page, and it's, I think there's just a typo, because it's referring to Chair Weiss, and later in the paragraph, it's Chair Deerhake, and of course it should be Chair Deerhake, both places.
Okay. Thank you. Yes, I think I had seen either in these minutes or the, it's the Water Quality Committee meeting minutes. I think we have a similar slip up that occurred. I'll have to mention that at the Water Quality Committee. They were moving around. So thank you for pointing that out.
And with that correction, I'd move to approve the minutes.
And I'll second.
We have a motion.
Commissioner Bailey.
Yes, thank you. Weiss and Bailey made the motion and second. Thank you. Any other comments or revisions to the minutes? If not, all those please say in favor, please say aye.
Aye.
Opposed? Motion carries. The meeting minutes are approved. Well, this is an uncommon meeting where we have no action items, but we do have a good deal of information to share with you regarding activities, I guess primarily legislative activities since we last met. But before we move into those, I will say that there is one agenda item on tomorrow's agenda for the EMC meeting, which is the forwarding of the approval to carry to EMC our vote in September on the gasoline service station and dispensing facilities. So it's currently scheduled for tomorrow. So without any further wait, let me ask Division Director Abrazinskas to provide his presentation. Thank you.
All right. Thank you, Madam Chair, and good morning, everyone. So first off, just want to send a shout out to our staff that are out sick today. We're here. Our complement of staff in the room are a little thin today due to some illnesses, but look forward to getting them back soon. And again, we were deferring information item 1 until January. Briefly, before I get into my presentation, I thought I'd do just a quick current events update. As you all may have heard, there are a number of wildfires occurring in the southeast right now in the southern Appalachians. So I thought I'd do a quick demonstration of an EPA tool that's helpful for you and the public in situations like this where areas of our state may be impacted by smoke from wildfires. This EPA fire and smoke map was developed and released back in 2020, and for the first time it combined regulatory data collected by state and local air agencies, those are the circles on the map, combined it with non-regulatory sensor data collected by really anyone that is able to pump that system into an information exchange. And so those are the squares on this map. And then overlaid on this map are satellite-derived and indicated fires. Those are the orange flame areas. You can kind of see very quickly where there are lots of orange flames in eastern Kentucky, southern West Virginia, western North Carolina, eastern Tennessee, northern Georgia, northwestern South Carolina right now. And then also overlaid on that is satellite-derived smoke plumes. So that's kind of the gray area that's shown there. So as we zoom in to our area, the southeast, you can start getting a sense of current air quality. So this is updated every hour. Again, our regulatory monitors are the circles. The squares are privately owned air quality sensors collecting indicator data of fine particulates. So this is all fine particulate or PM2.5 data shown on this map. And again, we can start zooming into where some of the active fires are in the western part of the state. Over here, south of Andrews, is the, there you go, the Collette Ridge fire, currently at over 3,900 acres. This is the report as of early this morning. And then some of the data that's being collected nearby from, again, indicator data from sensors for PM2.5. You can click on that purple square, which shows you what the current AQI is. Nowcast AQI of 298, an AQI of 298. You can click on history and actually get the concentration data here and see a line graph of the recent concentrations and see the latest hourly concentration near the fires, 290 micrograms per cubic meter in smoky conditions. And keep in mind, this is relative to a daily standard of 35, all right, 24-hour average of 35, and relative to an annual standard currently set at 12. So again, an hour, it's hard to relate an hour to a 24-hour or certainly an annual period, but certainly that's a concerning level of fine particulate. And so our team is doing forecasts for that particular area of the state. They have issued a code red air quality forecast for several counties, a code orange for several nearby counties, adjacent counties there in the western part of the state to help inform decision-making of the citizens in that part of the state. But thought I'd give a quick demo of this tool. I think it's very useful in situations like this and a good example of where non-regulatory sensor data, again, indicator data, can give you a sense of what the conditions are in smoky conditions due to wildfires.
AQI being air quality index, and
Yes.
maybe say how that compares to the actual measurement.
Yes, so an air quality index of above 100 is over the level of the standards that I mentioned earlier. So for the daily standard, it'd be a 24-hour average of over 35. The air quality index was created just as an easier tool for the public to understand, and it's broken down into the color codes because every pollutant has a different numerical standard. This kind of normalizes it to a standard scale, the air quality index. So there's more information on the specific cut points on EPA's website and our website as well.
Okay.
So again, just
Can I ask you real quick about the Andrews? Is that U.S. Forest Service land or is it private land?
that is a good question. I've lost sight of that because there are several fires in that part of the state that we're following right now, and I can't answer that right off the cuff, but could probably get that for you before the end of the meeting. There are several fires we're following that are contributing to smoky conditions, but the main ones are in Cherokee and in Henderson counties. Those are the main two right now that are causing the most issues from a smoke perspective. But again, regionally, there's a lot of fire occurring right now. Here in Raleigh today, the code yellow conditions that we're experiencing here in Raleigh, you can actually slightly smell the wildfire smoke and see some of it from higher floors in our buildings here in the downtown complex. And so certainly there are contributions statewide from the regional loading of fine particulates from wildfires right now. Anyhow, I thought I'd just do a quick demonstration there. I'll put that away and we'll proceed with my presentation this morning.
Thank you for doing that.
Yes, ma'am. Okay, how do I get back to the full page view on the PDF here, guys? Yep, go ahead. There you go. Excellent. Thank you so much. All right, so this morning, my presentation is going to focus first on provisions in the budget bill that passed a few months ago and impacts to the division and potential rulemaking impacts that follow. And then also a few slides on other potential 2024 rulemaking that we might be bringing through the committee to the commission. So this morning, I'll start with the budget bill provisions that impact air quality. There are two sections first that I'll touch on that place prohibitions on certain rulemaking actions. The first prohibits the DEQ, the EMC, and the Utilities Commission from requiring electric utilities to participate in a program that requires utilities to obtain allowances to offset their CO2 emissions. This is commonly characterized as emissions cap and trade programs or CO2 budget programs or cap and invest programs. The practical impact of this prohibition is that it prohibits the EMC from adopting the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative, or also known as RGGI, or RGGI, which was in front of the EMC as a petition for rulemaking. So with this action, it is our understanding that there is nothing left for the Commission to do on this topic. The second provision I'll touch on here on this slide prohibits DEQ, the EMC, the Department of Transportation, and the Department of Administration from adopting and enforcing standards related to the control of emissions of new motor vehicles or new motor vehicle engines, including requirements that mandate the sale or purchase of zero-emission vehicles. These prohibitions are not to be construed to affect the existing Vehicle Emissions Inspection and Maintenance, or I&M program, but the practical impact of this language is that it prohibits the EMC from adoption of the Advanced Clean Trucks Initiative, or ACT. Now, the division got to the point of finishing the fiscal note on this topic, and the OSBM certified fiscal note can be found on their website, and I provided that link here if you're so interested. I wanted to pause just for a moment here to thank our staff in the rulemaking branch, rule development branch, in our planning section for all the work on these two initiatives, their work on the financial analysis of these two initiatives. They were significant and challenging tasks, and the team really did a great job working on those. So I just want to thank them. Okay, the next provision in the budget bill I want to touch on this morning is related to air quality permitting review and issuance timelines. So first, the statute or this provision in the budget bill adds a new definition and a new term, and it's used in a few different places in different provisions I'll touch on today, and it's the term administratively complete. And as defined in the statute, that means all information that's required by statute, rule, or application form has been submitted to the department for the purposes of processing a permit application. So again, what's required via statute, rule, or application form. We think that may have been inadvertent using the term or there, because again, it probably should be statute, rule, and form. But anyway, the law says or, so that is the current definition in the law. Our rules currently use different terms to define a complete application. We use the terms completeness determinations, and there are also concepts that distinguish in our rules between a complete application and having all the information that's needed to effectively evaluate a source of air pollution. So that's the technical meat and what's needed to do a proper technical evaluation of the source. So it's possible that rulemaking may be needed to clarify and align terminology here that is very much now not aligned with the introduction of this definition in the statute. There are several rules that could potentially be impacted there. The other part of this provision, yes, ma'am.
Ask, has there been a conversation with the legislative staff or the drafters to confirm that it was intentional to say or versus and, or is that still, are y'all still working on that?
We are still working on that. That is one, what we would consider a technical correction that we have sent back through our legislative team back to the General Assembly. Yes, ma'am. The other portion of this provision includes specific timelines for certain permitting actions. And so it specifically requires the division to issue, deny, or publish for public notice and comment within 90 calendar days of receipt of, and here's that term, administratively complete application, or that's for minor modifications, or within 270 days of receipt of an administratively complete application for a major modification. So a couple observations here with this provision. First, this provision applies to all permit classes as written. Another observation is that it only applies to modifications, not to initial or greenfield permits and not to renewals. There also appears to be a little confusion between the law and the current rules for several of the procedural processes and processing timelines for various permit types. One such example is currently we do not define major modifications or minor modifications in the non-Title V permitting realm. That only exists in the Title V permitting realm. So there's question about intent here. Was the language meant to apply to all permit types or only to Title V permits for which we issue minor or major modifications? So we're working through our analysis to fully determine the scope of the rulemaking that may be necessary here. Okay, the next provision is a Title V research and development or R&D exemption. This would require and specifically requires rulemaking to create a Title V permit exemption for non-major research and development or R&D activities consistent with an EPA white paper published in 1995 addressing this very topic. And so currently our division reviews R&D activities consistently with that very EPA white paper. And so if emissions are above thresholds, above certain thresholds, a minor modification would be required for a facility that already holds a permit. The division's practices are consistent with the EPA white paper. So this doesn't really represent a meaningful change on how we handle such situations, but the biggest impact here is that there's instruction for the division to come to the commission with rulemaking to add this explicit exemption to our rules. And it also provides a timeline by which we complete that rulemaking and submit a Title V program amendment, and we believe that's a doable and workable timeline.
Can I ask a question, Madam Chair?
Yes, yeah.
So does the EPA white paper create an exemption? I think the answer is probably no, but I'm just curious.
Could you repeat the question, please? I'm sorry.
Does the EPA white paper actually create an exemption? I assume an actual exemption from permitting requirements would have to be in the rules, not in a white paper. And so I guess my question is whether the state legislation is actually requiring us to do something that may be inconsistent with EPA rules and the white paper.
You know, I think that's an excellent question that I'd like to think about and huddle with staff on a little bit more. I will note that EPA and federal regulations don't always fill in every available amount of white space on how to implement certain programs. And I think the white paper helps programs implement certain pieces and in this case, addresses the specifically how to handle R&D activities that might come along and would be truly considered an insignificant activity. But you ask, and the way you ask that is very interesting and one that I would want to follow up on with staff.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Based on my experience working in the federal rulemaking realm, I can't imagine not having it promulgated as a rule if there's truly an exemption for a category. So,
Okay, well, I will certainly follow up
Thank you
on
for
that
that
question. That's an excellent question. All right, so the next provision I'm going to cover is related to pre-permitting activities. And this provision is one that the division and the department was able to provide feedback on prior to it being finalized. This provision expands the list of activities that are allowable prior to obtaining a permit. Specifically, it says that construction, but not operation, of a new air contaminant source, equipment, or associated air cleaning or emissions control device is allowed so long as the applicant has submitted an administratively complete application to the division. There are exceptions included in this provision for prevention of significant deterioration permits and permits issued relative to Clean Air Act Section 112F, which is the residual risk program, and the MACT-Hammer provisions in 112J, and non-attainment provisions, which we really don't have any of those currently. So we have expressed, and from the time that we saw this, we expressed concerns about this provision for several reasons. One, allowing sources to construct without a permit conflicts with Section 110A2C of the Clean Air Act and its federal implementing regulations in Part 51, 40 CFR Part 51. There, federal law requires that each state's plan, state implementation plan, contain procedures by which the agency responsible for final decision-making on an application will ensure the applicable portions of the control strategy are met and will not interfere with attainment or maintenance of a national standard. And for instance, there's a sentence in Part 51, 160 that expressly requires state plans to contain procedures that allow the state to prevent construction or modification of a source if it will result in a violation of an applicable standard. Well, at the point of getting an administratively complete application, we wouldn't have done that technical review of the source yet to make that determination. So we see the language as inconsistent with the requirements of the Clean Air Act, Part 51, and portions of our federally approved state implementation plan in 40 CFR Part 52. EPA has reviewed and weighed in on this provision already and has expressed the same concerns that I just shared with you. Also, when considering this new provision alongside the remaining and existing statutory language, there appears to be some statutory construction issues with the provision, and we're working through that right now with our counsel. So we will be following up on this matter when it becomes a little bit more clear to us how the interaction of the new provision really interacts with some of the existing provisions in the law. All right, the next provision I'll touch on from the budget bill is one that both the department and the division had not requested and was not aware of until we saw the final conference committee budget bill. This provision is labeled as a Title V permit bonus pilot program, and it establishes this pilot program starting in January of 2024, and it sunsets the program on June 30th, 2025. The bill budgets $850,000 of non-recurring funding to this pilot program over the 2-year biennial budget period. The basic principles of this program are here on the slide. However, this concept is very detailed and very nuanced, and it covers 4.5 pages of the budget bill. So there are a lot of details that we simply won't cover here today. But the basic premise is that bonuses are possible for qualifying employees for reviewing and processing certain Title V permit types on the applicable schedule listed in the law. There are specific definitions in text explaining who the qualifying employees are. There are several eligible permit types as shown here on the slide, including minor modifications, major modifications, new Title V air permits, and prevention of significant deterioration and non-attainment new source review are the permit types. There are 4 processing schedules and associated bonus structures that decrease the number of processing days with time that would allow a qualifying employee to obtain certain bonus amounts. So it gets progressively harder over time to earn a bonus because the timelines for producing the permits decreases. There are provisions in the bill that detail payment schedules, how to calculate processing days for bonuses, how to calculate deductions if processing times exceed certain thresholds outlined in the law, and there are reporting requirements on the implementation of the program for the department and the division back to the General Assembly. So finally, the bonus program, pilot program, instructs the division to initiate temporary rulemaking to implement these provisions, including the development of quality control measures to measure the consistency and quality of Title V air permit processing that ensures each application is adequately reviewed, and if denied, there's good cause for denial. It's unclear what the impact of the temporary rulemaking has on the implementation of the program. In many ways, if any, in many ways, there's sufficient detail in the law to proceed with implementing the program. So now that this has become law, we are working on an implementation plan. And we are looking at how the required rulemaking part of this will work. We need to examine how to fairly implement this amongst the qualifying employees. We need to examine the distribution of the permit applications to the qualifying employees. We may have to deviate from our source sector subject matter expert approach that we've taken for many years, and I think is very popular, where we've had certain staff that become an expert on paper mills, or this staff have become experts on the electric generating sector, that those types of applications go to those permit engineers specifically, and we have teams built in that way. We may have to do something different, simply to divvy up the complexity fairly amongst all of the staff. We will have to create additional reports and do some associated programming in our database system for tracking and accounting purposes, and we're working with our staff on the many details associated with implementation. We've also submitted through our department's legislative team technical corrections that would help with the implementation of this program, and the aim to provide clarity for the implementation. One example of a correction that we had suggested is in the section where related to calculating processing days for bonuses, it doesn't fully consider all of the steps in the permitting process and the associated timelines when we hold a public hearing for a draft permit. And so we'll note here today, again, that a technical corrections bill, Senate Bill 508, did pass through the House on October 25th and was sent on to the Senate, where it now sits. That bill did address several, but not all, of our suggested technical corrections for this particular provision. One of those includes the requirement to do temporary rulemaking, where it changes the language from shall to may do temporary rulemaking to implement this provision. But again, that is not a law. That is a bill that sits currently over in the Senate, and we don't know what the final fate of that will be. So again, we're proceeding with implementation of the law as it stands today.
Commissioner Bailey.
Just kind of a quick question to sort of understand the impact of this. So the bonus permit is for Title V permits, and these, especially for the major permits, these are quite thick, and often facilities have many, many sources. And I can't remember, do these permits expire in 5 or 10 years?
Yes, ma'am. They have a shelf life of 5 years.
Okay, shelf life of 5 years. And then Do you have a ballpark figure of exactly of how many Title V permits we have in the state?
There are approximately 300 permitted Title V facilities. However, just the way the business works, facilities may request a variety of amendments to their permits at various times. And so we may find ourselves, while we're working on one application for facility X, they may submit 2 others
Well, they might
while we're
submit
working
a-
on one.
Yeah,
And so
modification.
you can often, or not often, but sometimes find that we might have 3 or 4 applications in-house for a single facility. And then we ask the facility, okay, well, we were working on the first one, and would you like us to combine these? And so that's another complicated piece to this program, because each of those are separate applications that could be eligible for a bonus under this program. But the more orderly way for us to process those in the past would have been to combine them, right, into one action, take a little longer, but get them all done at once and go through one public process for all of those for perhaps. So that's one example of many.
So, but based on your answer, it's hard for you to forecast, say, how many permit applications or modifications are coming through each year? Or do you have kind of a, normally we have 300 permits out there, but normally we're going to see 50 in a year? Or do you have an idea?
We do, and we track that. We've mined that data. And I'd say that the numbers in terms of total applications are flat. The thing that's very difficult to predict moving forward, and you can't really predict this based on some of your recent history, is what's the complexity and what type of applications make up the 250 or so, or whatever the number is that we're processing per year.
It is about how much you have 300 permits, but you might be processing 250.
I think the average incoming applications, about 220.
Around 220 incoming per year on average. And we have those statistics. Sorry, I didn't bring all those at my
That's
fingertips
okay.
today.
That's good enough to understand the scope of what your permitting group does. Thank
Yes.
you.
And current, I'm sorry.
And how many staff people?
Yes, ma'am. So there are about 25 blocks on the org chart in this particular section. 6 of those positions are currently vacant. And so we're working really hard to fill those currently. I think at this time, our engineers that work on these permit applications in that section have between 8 to 14 applications each on their desk right now. Each engineer does.
So there's $850,000 for 21 engineers?
Yes, ma'am.
Do you know of any other state that has a program like this?
I haven't done a survey since this came out. We've been really focused on how to develop this implementation plan and get it working by January 1. So I haven't had a chance to survey other states, but right off, I'm not aware of any without asking and inquiring.
Chair Smith?
So the timelines of all this are really somewhat troubling. If you have to have a program that starts into implementation in January, one of the big questions about this is if you start rewarding people for faster permit reviews and approvals, that does raise the quality question, which is why there's language in the provision, presumably, about that. And yet, even with temporary rulemaking, we are unlikely, and these would be EMC rules, we are unlikely to have any measures in place. And I hear what you're saying in terms of, obviously, the statutes and rules establish the actual standards for these permits. I think the question that will be raised, and the question that I think the legislative language currently anticipates, is, yes, but is this process going to put at risk the completeness and carefulness and consistency of that review process? And if so, and who is going to be looking at that? Is it just the supervisors and DAQ? So we could be, 6 months into this program without any sort of guidelines, without the commission having even talked about, how to deal with the quality control side of it. And if the legislature is inclined to make changes, technically they're not supposed to be back in session till next, May, end of April, May, or whatever.
I think they're in recess till the end of November 29th,
Well,
I
that's
think.
true, yeah.
So-
We do have this ongoing thing. So there is that. So the timing question is troubling. But the other thing, tying back to the quality control issue, is there's also language in the provision that says that EMC can temporarily reduce the payout of bonus payments to a qualifying employee if Title V permit application processing fails to meet the quality standards. And I think that's going to raise some real questions about implications for the State Personnel Act. And is that an employment action that has consequences on that side of the ledger? It's just very complicated and a very short timeline that's driving toward a pilot program for which we may not have a good handle on the quality control and how to implement that before we're well into it. That's a concern. I don't know what to do with it, but that's a concern.
Yeah, and I would add the word rigor, because it needs to be a rigorous review. It's expected to be a rigorous review. And you talk about engineers. These permit reviews require best engineering judgment of data. I mean, it's not a cookie cutter process. Every facility is different. And because you're saying you're at risk of not being able to tap the expert engineers who are not normally assigned to all these permits, that creates another issue, that you're not going to get the rigor of review that is required for us to maintain our Title V delegation.
You all raised some great concerns, and the one related to the temporary rulemaking. Again, we mapped out, what if scenarios if we brought you a temporary rulemaking package today, which obviously we weren't prepared for. Even if we did that and went through the temporary rulemaking process, and it all went well, if you make some assumptions there, that temporary rule would ultimately expire before the end of the pilot program. And so it again calls into question, does that mean we start, was the intent for us to start permanent rulemaking and then we wouldn't finish the permanent rulemaking before the end of the pilot program? So again, those are amongst some of our questions that we put back in our technical corrections. And we see as the statute containing sufficient detail to move forward with implementation, but the piece on quality that we are instructed to work with the commission on, it doesn't say do rulemaking in that paragraph, but it clearly says to work with the commission on that. And so what that looks like is something that we're still working through.
Yes, Commissioner Bailey.
Well, this is more like a comment, but as someone who worked in the industry and had to work on negotiations of a Title V permit for a major manufacturing facility, and worked with the US EPA in a whole different region of the country on it. I mean, we looked at things like best available control technology, and I think we appreciated that there was expertise in a particular industry to move the permit along perhaps faster, because they saw other facilities that were using the same or better control technology, and that's how part of the permit processing.
Mm-hmm.
And if you start mixing up the engineers, then you lose that knowledge that I think made the process go faster, at least for us, because we knew the other industries within the state. So that's just a comment that I think it's always a good idea to have, certain expertise with all these incredibly technical issues.
Yeah. And to be sure, part of our succession planning is to pair up our experienced subject matter experts with junior staff to build depth within our organization. And even in this bonus program, it contemplates the concept of more than one qualifying employee of the same type working on and reviewing and processing a permit. And in that case, it gives the director the ability to apportion the eligible bonus by the appropriate percentage between the qualifying employees. However, when you go back to the section that talks about the qualifying employees, it only refers to the primary reviewer and the primary supervisor and the primary administrative support person. So it appears that the flexibility that exists later is narrowed back by that particular language. And so that flexibility may not actually be there in reality. So again, that was one of our comments on this once we saw the language. And so we're working through it. Don't have all the answers here for today, by all means, but we're working on and working forward to an implementation date of January 1 as instructed in the statute.
Yes, Commissioner Bailey.
Well, just one other comment. I certainly welcome any bonuses to our employees. Just want to say that. I think they deserve anything they can get.
Thank you. I appreciate that.
So how does the division plan to keep the EMC abreast of any changes to the shall versus may in the temporary rule and implementation on January 1 if we are not meeting to be involved?
I expect that we will provide regular updates at scheduled meetings. At this point, we haven't gotten any further than that. To be honest, there are many aspects of this provision and others that how those other provisions are clarified and implemented impact this program, the bonus program. So the answers on all the prior slides play a role in how this will actually function. So my commitment is to keep y'all informed.
Thank you.
All right, the next provision, we're not done. The next provision in the budget bill that impacts the committee and the division is one that reduces the vehicle emissions inspection or I&M program requirements. First off, it changes the vehicles that are subject to the program to those that are shown here on the sub-bullet on the slide. But more significantly, it removes 18 of the 19 counties that remain in the program, leaving Mecklenburg County in the program. This provision also requires the department to prepare and submit a state implementation plan or SIP revision to EPA, basically a non-interference demonstration that the removal of this foundational control program that's in all of our SIPs will not impact or interfere with our attainment and maintenance of the National Ambient Air Quality Standards. And the bill also provides a sufficient runway for us to do this work because it's a significant amount of work. And once that work is complete, it also puts EPA on a clock to review a SIP amendment. So the effective date could be up to 32 months from now. So let me explain just a little bit more about how that clock and that timeline looks. So the bill requires the division to prepare and submit that SIP revision to EPA within 12 months. And we feel like we can do that. We've started that work. But it's a lot of work, and it will take us most, if not all, of that 12 months to get that completed and into EPA. And we coordinate with EPA along the way as well to make sure that we're on the right track because we don't want 12 months of work to just land on their desk and they tell us we did it wrong. So it's a coordinated effort with them along the way. Once that submission gets to EPA, they then have 18 months to review and act on the SIP revision. And if approved by EPA, then the statute or the bill language here says that the changes would then become effective on the first day of the month, that's 60 days after the secretary certifies to the reviser of statutes that EPA actually approved that amendment to our SIP. So again, in total, that could take up to 32 months from the time that the bill became law. If and when these provisions become effective, then revenues associated with this program will drop significantly. So not only for DAQ, but also for DOT. For DAQ, we get 65 cents per emissions inspection. So discussions have started and with the General Assembly centered on revenue replacement for this program, which is a critical piece for our division's ability to function. Given that there's a long runway here and it could be up to 32 months from now to when this becomes effective, we would be looking at state fiscal years, either state fiscal year 25-26 or 26-27, when the revenue replacement would need to kick in. All right. So that's the end of the budget bill provisions impacting the Division of Air Quality. So now I'm going to transition to a few other items that we have on our agenda that could potentially come to the commission in 2024 as rulemaking packages. The first one I think we may have previously mentioned is related to synthetic minor permit fees. Synthetic minor facilities are those that have the potential to be a major source or Title V facilities, if not for the condition in their permit that they're taking to stay below those major source thresholds. We have 620 such facilities permitted in North Carolina. On average, we issue those permits in, on average, about 45 days. State law requires that we do that within 90 days. We have undertaken an analysis to review the level of effort associated with this permitting and associated compliance program and compare that to the revenues that come in under this program. And there's a $1 million gap between level of effort and revenues, okay? The fees for this particular program haven't been touched since they were originally created in 1994. The current application fee is $400 and the annual fee is $1,500. So I'll also note that under this program for many years, given that the permit fees haven't covered the level of expenses associated with this program, we've been able to subsidize this state permitting program with some of our other receipts, including the Vehicle Emissions Inspection and Maintenance Program receipts, which will potentially drop off significantly up to 32 months from now. So given that expenses have increased in terms of staffing expenses while revenues have stayed flat or decreased, we've reached that breaking point where we need to address this gap in the form of some sort of change to the fees for these particular type of facilities. So what we'd like to do is start a stakeholder process, engaging with those that are affected, and really clearly articulate the problem statement, lay out all of the issues, the numbers, the figures, and allow them to help us design a solution. And thus, once we have that solution in hand, we would bring that to you, to the committee and to the commission to run that through the rulemaking process. But there's one catch, and that is there are legislative maximums that apply to the fees for this permit type. And those maximums for the annual fee are set at the current fee level. So we're already when the fees were initially set in '94, they were set at the statutory maximum. So on a somewhat parallel path, we would need to consider and need to pursue changes to that maximum in statute before we really get too far into a process with you all here at the commission. So I'm raising this as just to be transparent that it's possible that we're going to bring this to you sometime in 2024, but a lot of that depends on our ability to get that legislative change on the maximums. Okay. The next item that we could potentially bring in 2024 is related to federal rule and emissions guidelines that will be promulgated, we believe, in April, no later than April of 2024. And this is related to greenhouse gas emissions from the electric generating sector. Some of you that have been around a while may recall that we've presented in front of the commission 2 renditions of rules for this sector. The first was under the name of the Clean Power Plan at the federal level. The second was the Affordable Clean Energy Rule, or ACE rule. With both of those federal efforts failing, and we partially got through rulemaking and analysis for both of those efforts before they became paperweights rather, we now are looking at the 3rd rendition of these federal rules and guidelines that impact these emissions from this particular sector. And so while some of these rules, federal rules, will be adopted by reference automatically, there are components of this that impact existing facilities where we would have to develop a robust state plan to implement the emission guidelines, or EGs, that come out of EPA in April. So when EPA proposed this earlier this year, they proposed to give states 2 years to develop a final plan. That's a very ambitious timeline for a complicated subject. So we'll see what the final rule looks like. But again, we're anticipating that final rule in 2024, and we anticipate bringing a concept at some point, summer or fall of 2024, on this, and beginning to work on this in earnest mid-2024. All right, the next item that you could potentially see in 2024 is related to another federal rule making, the Air Emissions Reporting Requirements, or AERR rule, which is out for public comment right now. In fact, EPA extended the comment period to November 17th. And so I'll say that we are currently working on our comments with regard to this proposal. But in general, the premise of this rule proposal from EPA is that it would require the collection of hazardous air pollutant, or HAP, data from a lot of stationary sources. And you might say, well, don't we already do that here in North Carolina? We collect hazardous air pollutant data from our stationary sources. And you'd be right, we do that. However, this federal proposal would make it a requirement for every state and local to collect that data, or for those facilities to directly report it to EPA. So there are lots of nuances here, but if this rule goes final as proposed at some point in 2024, as we anticipate, it would require changes to some of our rules. And so we won't get in depth as explaining what or how or why, given we're at the proposal stage right now. But I think it's reasonable to anticipate that'll be something that's coming your way. In general, I can give you the quick preview of our comment letter. We're certainly supportive of the concept of EPA asking for this HAP data and collecting it. Again, we've been doing that in North Carolina for some time, but there are concerns about shortening of the timelines that the states and locals would have to not only collect this data from stationary sources, and potentially a larger universe of stationary sources than we currently do, shortening those timelines for collection and then quality assurance of that data. Also, we will not support an option that requires facilities to report this twice, duplicative reporting to both the federal government and to the states and locals. We'd like it to just occur once, and we're urging EPA to allow states to collect that data, as most states already do.
Well, given that, why would we write a letter supporting what EPA is doing here if it's already being done?
I apologize if I may have misspoke there, saying that more generally. I did not mean to, that we have concerns with several aspects of this proposal, and we will express those in the comment letter. The general concept of collecting HAP data is one that we can support, in that we already do that. But how and from whom, those details do matter. And then the data protocols on where it's submitted, how we can get the data, and not having required facilities to support that data twice are key to this working and being functional.
Well, at least with respect to North Carolina, I won't speak for any other states that may not be doing this. It sounds like it's wholly unnecessary, and why aren't we making that point to them? And really asking the question, why are you doing this?
Not all the ink is dried or is even written on our comment letter yet, so
Okay.
probably not appropriate for me to extend that part of it yet. It's undergoing further review, but those are just a few of the things we wanted to highlight that we felt certain about here at this point here on November 8th.
Well, certainly going after the duplicative nature of much of it, you certainly should be doing, no question about that. I'm just concerned about the overall tone, though. Okay.
Thank you.
Um,
Yes, ma'am.
What criteria pollutant precursors are you seeing from them? Any unusual, any new ones introduced? Precursors.
So this rule focuses on collection of hazardous air pollutant data, those identified under the Clean Air Act.
Oh,
And so
excuse me, you're saying the current rule requires
the
criteria?
current rule already requires criteria pollutants and precursors. This will add a requirement to collect hazardous air pollutant
Okay.
data.
Thank you.
Yes, ma'am. Okay, so just again, this is a heads up that this may be something, once this rule becomes final, that you all may be seeing in 2024. All right, and then one more item that you all may be seeing in 2024, or will be seeing in 2024, is related to the periodic review and expiration of rules, or H74 process. This is the readoption round 2, where we do the initial binning and classifying of all of our air quality rules. And we are on a timeline to do that. And so if my understanding is correct from staff, that we'll be aiming to do that late 2024 or the earliest possible AQC action item on the report would occur in 2025, but we'd likely have more conversations about that leading up to that meeting. So just a heads up on that, and that's probably not foreign to you on given many other divisions will be going through that process as well. All right, one more item that will be coming before you in 2024 is related to the amendments to anticipated to the National Ambient Air Quality Standards for Fine Particles, or PM 2.5. EPA proposed a more stringent annual standard back in January, a range of 9.0 to 10.0 micrograms per cubic meter for an annual standard. They also took comment on a range as low as, or an annual standard as low as 8, as high as 11. EPA final action on a new, more stringent annual standard is expected next month. And so this would necessitate changes to our ambient standard rules in O2D 0400 once the EPA action becomes final and effective. So I thought it would be important and interesting to share with you where our current data stands relative to that proposed range, and also taking into consideration some of the impacts from the wildfires earlier this year. And so each line on this graph represents a monitoring site, a PM 2.5 monitoring site in North Carolina, with the latest 3-year monitored design values on the right-hand side of this graph. Okay, and so we've also highlighted that the range that EPA is proposing, the 9 to 10 microgram range, is that orange bar there between 9 and 10 on the graph. Now we need to caveat this latest data, the 21 to 23 data. There's a big asterisk there and a lot of red text on the screen that highlights that this is provisional data that includes the actual 2023 monitored data for the first 3 quarters of this year, but obviously we're still collecting data for the 4th quarter of 2023. So what we did is we substituted 2020 or the quarter 4 2023 data with last year's quarter 4 just as a surrogate to give us some sense of what we might be looking at here in taking into account what actually happened in quarters 1 through 3. And this illustrates the impact of the wildfire smoke that occurred during the 2nd and 3rd quarters of this year on the overall 3-year average values. We now have several monitoring sites that are above the lower range that EPA is proposing at 9.0 micrograms per cubic meter. So again, you see those endpoints of those lines ending in the orange box there on the graph. You'll notice that all design values in this provisional data set went up statewide due to the influences of wildfire smoke, but the majority of our sites are projecting values below that 9.0 microgram per cubic meter. But again, if not for the wildfires, all of these lines would be outside of that orange box. Okay, so let's take a little closer look. So if you simply take all of the state PM 2.5 data in June, July, and August of 2022, the blue trace versus 2023, the orange trace, you can see that on average a 6.17 microgram difference in the average, month-long average statewide in June. That's a significant impact there from the wildfires. And that continued in July and August. We now have the September data as well. I think the September difference is down below 1 microgram. But here we are, again, where we started my presentation earlier today with additional wildfires in our state occurring right now that have the potential to impact some of this data here in 2023. We do have, EPA has exceptional events policies and rules that apply only if an area it ends up in non-attainment due to those exceptional events. So we are very carefully looking at that. We are currently flagging all data from this summer that is impacted by wildfires. There's a big national meeting in February that we're going to take place out in St. Louis, where EPA will gather state and local agencies about exceptional events, and that'll be in context of the new PM 2.5 standards. So lots of discussion around exceptional events, policies, and rules that typically we have not had experience or a need, honestly, or even we haven't been eligible to apply it in North Carolina. And now we're facing that possibility for some of our sites. And pretty much that's the case for all of the eastern U.S. states now for the first time, given the Canadian wildfire influences east of the Mississippi this year. So there'll be a lot more eastern U.S. representation at this meeting on this topic in early 2024. So I saw a question here, but I'll be glad to take that. But I just want to say thank you for the opportunity to brief you on all of these things. And like I said, we don't have answers where there are lots of questions for many of these things, but glad to take additional questions from you now. Thank you.
Any questions? Well, I'll ask a question with the last graph you showed. It just triggered in my mind in those particular months. Is the department, the division, talking with HHS or anyone who is tracking ER or doctor's visits for respiratory issues that are arising that could be attributed to these higher exposures?
Yes, thank you. Thank you for that question. I've had a preliminary conversation with officials at DHHS on this, and we're exchanging data. Mainly, we are exchanging data on what the actual levels were for such an analysis right now. So, yes, that is the dialogue has started to try to get some of that information on to see if there's any information at all or any data that shows a correlation in health impacts in the areas that were impacted and at the times the impacts occurred.
Could you give us an estimated time in 2024 when you might report back to us about that?
I will do that as soon as I have a good sense of it myself. I need to talk again with our colleagues at DHHS.
Thank you. Are there any questions? Yes, Chair Smith.
So one other question about federal activity. My memory is that the Biden administration proposed new vehicle emission standards back in the spring. Do you know what the status of that is?
Yes, there are several moving pieces and parts there, and I don't have those all recited to memory, but those are all on track as far as I'm aware that apply to NOx. Well, there's some that apply to NOx emission engine standards for light duty and heavy duty vehicles, and there's some that are more focused on GHGs from vehicles of various weight classes. I don't have the expected final implementation dates in my head right now, Chair Smith, but I'll be glad to follow up. But it's my understanding all of those are on track.
So, Madam Chair, one quick follow-up to that. Does the new state provision limiting EMC adoption of standards, emission standards for new vehicles, does that affect our ability to implement any future federal standard? Because my memory is the language in that state legislative provision, it wasn't limited to electric vehicles. It talked more broadly about new vehicle emission standards, and it talked in terms of both adoption and enforcement.
We'll be glad to take a closer look at that. My preliminary read on that is no, in that the state doesn't have the authority to implement those federal engine standards that come out of EPA. That is retained at the federal level.
Thanks.
Well, the division has a lot to process. Thank you for sharing that with us, and in turn, it could come before the EMC, and we want to keep informed about that. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
We also have on our agenda any additional remarks that you might have? Are there any other topics? You mentioned briefly vacancies. How is that going?
Yes, ma'am. Currently, our division has 27 vacancies, and so that's remained pretty steady here recently. We have successfully onboarded 14 new employees since June 1st, which is excellent. Very excited about that. Lots of great energy, lots of young professionals. They're drinking from the fire hose, but they're great, and we're excited to have them and be part of our team. And they have a steep learning curve on things like Title V permitting and compliance visits and all the various complicated things that we work on. But we're excited about them and excited about bringing more on as we can. We have 3 important retirements coming up before the end of the year. One of our section chiefs, Steve Hall, our technical services section chief, will retire at the end of the year, and we're in the process of interviewing folks to fill that role. And we have some critical losses within our technical services section in our stationary source compliance branch right now as well, where pretty much I think 90% of the branch is eligible to retire, and 2 of them are this month. So we're working on that, and I'll say a few more words maybe about this tomorrow. I think I include a few remarks in my full commission written remarks, but it's an area of continuous work and improvement. The department HR folks have been great. We're implementing new buddy systems and HR onboarding things, and at the division level, we also are doing new onboarding with leadership summits where the new employees get to come meet with me and Taylor Hartsfield and our senior leadership team for an entire day, and we just spend time getting to know them and us getting to know them and them getting to know us and what our workplace culture is like. So those are new types of things that we're attempting to implement across the department, but it is a challenge. And I think at the end of the day, the biggest challenges come down to offering a fair salary. I think that's our greatest challenge by far. But again, I'm proud of the work that we're able to do currently with the staff that we have, and again, excited about some of our new hires. Thank you.
And I think we talked about the annual report that the division released in the past month or so. Maybe in January, we could hear about that, some of the success stories.
Absolutely. I think if Randy was here today to give his orientation on the planning section, he would have touched on some of that today, because his team did a lot of that work that went into our annual trends report showing the longer term trends in air quality and emissions data. My favorite graph in his set of slides show the air emissions inventory for hazardous air pollutants and toxic air pollutants having been reduced by over 120 million pounds over the last 2 decades. That's something that we should all be proud of. That has probably a more significant impact on public health than any of us really realize. And we talk a lot about particulates and ozone, and those are of concern, but those hazardous air pollutants are of particular concern. And the fact that we've reduced that inventory by that much over that period of time, I think is noteworthy. So we'll look forward to saying a few more words about that in January, Madam Chair.
Commissioner Carter, you were going to
Yeah,
say?
just a quick question. You said you've got 27 vacancies out of a total of how many?
Out of 203 total positions on the org chart.
Okay.
Statewide, yes.
Yeah.
Yep.
Oh, yeah.
Yep.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Do any of the members have anything they would like to say before we adjourn? Thank everyone for being here today. The meeting's adjourned. We will meet again January 10.